trafficking prosecutions. My name is Charlie Whitman, and I'm an Associate Attorney Advisor at AEquitas, the prosecutor's resource on violence against women, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. This webinar will provide practical information and investigative strategies that will assist in the identification, investigation, and successful prosecution of traffickers. It will address how digital evidence can corroborate victim and witness testimony, support charging decisions, and reinforce evidence-based trial strategies that do not rely entirely upon victim testimony. Before we begin the substantive portion of our program, I will provide a brief overview of our Ilink webinar service. You can listen to this webinar either via computer or conference call. For the best use of Ilink, I strongly recommend calling in from a landline to our conference line, which is 530-881-1212. The passcode is 202-731-738#. That number is in the upper left-hand portion of your screen. If you're using a mobile phone, please do not use the speaker option, but listen with an earpiece if necessary. All call-in participants have been automatically muted for the duration of today's webinar. Public chat has been disabled, my apologies, but private chat is available. Today's webinar is also being recorded for later viewing. To connect to the Internet audio, you can click the Connect button on your start screen. If you use the Internet audio option, please do not also call into the webinar, but only do so if you experience difficulty with your Internet audio. If you have technical issues, you can use the Ilink hand raise indicator, which is located on the toolbar in the top left-hand portion of your screen above the presenter's photo and to the right of the conference call number. You can also contact Ilink directly at 1-800-799-4510. Throughout today's webinar, we encourage you to post comments and questions. You can private chat those to me, Charlie Whitman, and I will share your questions anonymously with our presenter so that they can be addressed during today's presentation. Today's webinar is hosted by AEquitas, the prosecutor's resource on violence against women, through funding from the U.S. Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women. Written materials, including a copy of today's presentation, our presenter's biography, will be emailed to you after the webinar. AEquitas' mission is to improve the quality of justice in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking cases by developing, evaluating, and refining prosecution practices that increase victim safety and offender accountability. AEquitas provides prosecutors with the support, training, mentorship, and resources necessary to objectively evaluate and constantly reexamine and refine their approach to justice. AEquitas staff conduct legal research, provide 24/7 case consultations, host specialized and state-specific training events and webinars, provide individual experts to jurisdictions and organizations, and publish articles, monographs, and other resources on topics relevant to the prosecution of violence against women. And just a note, today's presentation uses photos that are graphic but have been blurred and redacted to remove any identifying information and to protect victim privacy. Today's presenter is Jane Anderson, AEquitas Attorney Advisor. Prior to joining AEquitas, Jane served as an Assistant State Attorney in Miami-Dade County, Florida. As a prosecutor, she tried many of the state's first human trafficking cases, including related sexual assault, child abuse, and money laundering crimes. Jane is a founding member of the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Human Trafficking Unit and Task Force, and she also built a coalition of service providers and community leaders to provide victims with the services necessary to help rebuild their lives and assist in the prosecutions of their traffickers. Prior to focusing on human trafficking prosecutions, Jane served as the Chief of Litigation for the Misdemeanor Domestic Violence Unit. She has prosecuted homicides, domestic violent crimes, sexual assault, and other violent crimes. I'd now like to turn the presentation over to Jane for the substantive portion of today's webinar.
Hi, thank you, Charlie, for that. This webinar is meant to address an audience that has a basic understanding of sex trafficking, so I'm not going to go over a lot of the basics. But this webinar does have the objective to identify all the different ways that traffickers are using technology to both control and manipulate their victims, but also to just keep their operation ongoing. Once we've identified those forms of technology, we also want to make sure we're securing that evidence so that it can be used potentially at trial. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can strengthen cases by making sure we're not just charging sex trafficking, but we're also charging all the other co-occurring crimes that these offenders are committing at the same time. both so the offender is wholly held accountable, but also so that should the victim at some point choose not to participate, we would still be able to go forward on some of the charges, if not all of them. And finally, a consistent objective of AEquitas is to make sure that we are collaborating with all of our allied professionals. And in this particular case, our allied professionals, particularly advocates, are going to be able to help investigators and prosecutors pinpoint avenues of digital and cyber investigation that might be helpful. Because those advocates may be the people that are going to best know what types of social media or online activity the victims are engaged in. So as much as, we're familiar with Facebook, most of the young people are continually finding new social media outlets, including Mocospace or Kik, and that's where our advocates can really help us do that. So we always want to make sure we're collaborating effectively. So what are the digital breadcrumbs? I use that term because the Internet and all of our online activity does lend itself to a certain amount of anonymity. So that's one of the wonderful things about the Internet when it comes to criminals. They love that about it. However, when traffickers are using the Internet to commit their crimes, they are leaving behind a certain amount of footprints, or in this case, I'm referring to them as digital breadcrumbs. When we use the right cyber investigative techniques, we'll be able to find those digital breadcrumbs and follow the investigated leads that they give us, and also preserve the evidence for trial. And in this case, we can use the digital breadcrumbs to find the identity of the trafficker, and not just the identity of the trafficker himself, but you may be able to find any co-conspirators, witnesses, any additional victims that you perhaps were not aware of. The breadcrumbs can also help identify the organization's size and scope. By the number of victims and co-conspirators, you can get a sense of the operation size. You may also be able to find geographic information that can give you a sense of scope, whether this is a trafficking operation that's occurring in one particular city, regionally, nationally, or even internationally. Additionally, the digital breadcrumbs can provide corroboration. And this is going to be a big piece of the presentation today. And as you all know, corroboration is key in these cases where a victim otherwise may be subjected to somebody's sort of he said, she said ideology. Additionally, we can find co-occurring crimes. And that is all the additional criminal activity that these offenders are committing while they're also sex trafficking the victim. And ultimately, as you guys all know, anyone that's familiar with sex trafficking cases, inevitably there will become a point where victims are not participating or cooperating. And with the digital breadcrumbs, you may be able to prosecute both the sex trafficking charge and those co-occurring crimes without a participating victim. So basically, there's two things that following the digital breadcrumbs can give us. Number one, we're going to build stronger cases through these cyber investigations. Number two, through building stronger cases, we are alleviating some of the pressure on the victims and therefore supporting these victims. It's not going to be all on their shoulders when we have corroborating digital evidence. When I talk about creative charging, I want to make sure that all prosecutors and law enforcement are looking at both victim-dependent crimes and victim-non-dependent crimes. So here's a small list of some of the charges that we should be thinking about. Some of them fall into sort of the domestic violence aspect, your batteries, your kidnapping, false imprisonment, sexual assault, interference with custody when there's a minor involved. Those charges, especially let's say the interference with custody charge, if you've got a parent or guardian willing to testify, you may not need the minor victim to go forward on that. Additionally, the co-occurring crimes that aren't victim dependent at all are going to be your money laundering, perhaps child pornography, and drug offenses and racketeering. So corroborating evidence. This is a big piece of why we are looking for this digital evidence. What are the tools? So there are three types of means to get this digital evidence. The first one is through the subpoena. And you can usually get subscriber information for digital accounts and transactional history. With search warrants, you'll need a search warrant to get inside of a cell phone, inside of a computer, to get any content that's related to Facebook or other online sites. And then this is a little bit in flux right now as far as the court orders go, and it looks like this may even be going towards search warrants. So I may encourage you to get a search warrant when you're looking for location data, but that's something that has historically been able to be sought through a court order. So there is an assumption that everyone on this webinar has a basic understanding of sex trafficking investigations and some of the challenges that they face. So to put this up here as a typical investigation, just to give some framework. So this is talking about a typical undercover vice operation, perhaps targeting juveniles or targeting trafficking, or perhaps just your old-fashioned vice sting. And many times it'll come through where a undercover police officer has found an online escort ad, has called the ad, has arranged for a date with a female on the other side of the ad, has responded to a motel room where there has been words of solicitation and the typical takedown. Inside of the motel room, you're likely to find some cell phones, maybe laptops. Also, you may find these prepaid debit cards. So these are the three big pieces of the digital breadcrumbs that we're going to be talking about today. So what can we get from these three things that are included in most undercover operations? And that is, what can we get from that online escort ad that was viewed and responded to? What can we get from those cell phones that are hopefully seized from the room? And then also these prepaid debit cards that are frequently used to post the ads to pay for the room, etc. So starting with the advertisement, I've included here just a typical back page ad. And this is actually the ad that comes with when you subpoena Backpage. And you can tell the difference here because of this yellow box. You can see that here. That yellow box is administrative information. Everything else really appears how it does online. So I've included Backpage, but this is the same for most online escort forums. And you'll see that there's the place where it's posted. You'll see an email that was used to post it. And of course, you'll have some pictures here, the date and the time, and the advertising title. So what can we get from Backpage.com? From these subpoenas, and you can get all of this with a simple subpoena to Backpage.com. They tend to be incredibly law enforcement friendly and will get you what you request within typically 24 hours. So three main things that you're going to get from your Backpage.com subpoena request. The first one is the IP address. The IP address will be provided both for the ad itself and then also for each time that ad was reposted. So hopefully you're fairly familiar with the way Backpage.com works. Similar to Craigslist, you can place an ad and you can have that ad sort of refreshed so it appears sort of at the top of the list. Each time that you have it reposted, you have to pay another fee, which will generate another invoice. You will get each and every one of those invoices with your subpoena results, and you'll have different IP addresses for both the creation of the ad itself and then also for each and every invoice that was made. You're also going to have that email address that's associated with the count, and then from that email address, we're going to have some other opportunities to investigate. And then the third thing you'll get from Backpage.com is the payment information, which of course can't be in cash, and so you will have some sort of credit card information. So starting with the IP address. As I've shown here, we have both the information from Backpage about when the ad itself was created, gives you a date, time, and the IP address. And then this is sort of a snippet of one individual invoice. So you'll see that they are from different IP addresses. What do you do with this IP address? Well, unfortunately, a majority of the IP addresses may come from mobile phones. However, a lot of times you'll also be able to find out if they're using a wireless account associated with a hotel, with a Starbucks, or if the organization has a home base, there may actually be a residential IP address that's connected to these ads. So I've put down here ARIN. ARIN is the American Registry for Internet Numbers. That's a free website online. It's irin.net, and it's very simple to use. Basically, there's a search box in the top right corner, and you just copy and paste that IP address into ARIN. What it will do is it will immediately give you who owns it. So it's not going to tell you, the person, the trafficker, but it'll tell you whether it's Comcast or AT&T or T-Mobile. That way, you can then issue a subpoena to the owner of the IP address. If you include the IP address and the date and time that you're looking for example, in this case, Sunday, July blank, 2012, along with an IP address and subpoena AT&T, they'll be able to give you who is registered to that address. That can be very helpful in many of our cases to identify the trafficker. Okay, moving on to the email address. As you know, more and more people are using sort of internet-based email addresses. So I have here an example of gmail.com. You also see yahoo.com, any number of them. And you can you give yourself the name. So you're not always looking at a great, aha moment when it says the trafficker's first and last name and gmail.com, although I have seen that many a time. But you can, don't stop looking, don't stop there. A lot of times email address will include a nickname that you recognize. So for example, I think we see it later in the presentation. The trafficker goes by the name Casanova, and the Gmail is Casanova such and such. Clearly that's going to be corroborating evidence, and that should be admissible that this belongs to him. Through this email address also, you can search for domain for social media, Facebook, Instagram, sometimes a wrap label. Also, the domain name itself, if it is a unique name, or you can even if it's Gmail or something, they will, if you subpoena Gmail, they will give you no content, but they will give you usually the registration information. Again, that's all self-reported, but traffickers don't necessarily think you're going to be able to figure that all the way out. So you may see that Casanova has registered casanova@gmail.com using a real name, a real address, or something like that. Gmail will also give you all the IP logins that the person used with that address. If those IP logins match the IP logins with the Backpage ads, that's going to be really powerful evidence for you. So we'll go through a couple of things here. So for example, on the left-hand side, you have, this is an invoice from Backpage.com. Now that email address has to be a real email address. It can't be gibberish. But the name, the address, the city, the state, everything else can be pure gibberish. I've included this because it kind of gives you an example of someone who thought they were being very clever, and when it comes to their name, they entered gibberish. But this address and phone number were, in fact, legitimate addresses and phone numbers. Additionally, the email used did include a partial recognition of the name. So once you get that email address, one of the quickest and most effective ways to try to further lock down the identity of the person posting the ads is to just simply cut and paste that email address into the search engine within Facebook. So here, again, it's blocked off, but you can see that the email address was just entered into that search engine and immediately came down with the person that had a Facebook account registered with that email account. And although it's blurred here, you see that it immediately took you to that person's Facebook account, verifying their identity, and then not only that, but now you have the entire contents of their Facebook that you can cull through to find whatever information, corroborating evidence you can within their Facebook. You can also further send a search warrant if you have probable cause that the trafficker is using Facebook in the course of the trafficking to get the content from Facebook directly from that, and you've linked it that way. This is actually a fun one that I wanted to include because it shows how you continue to sort of go through these breadcrumbs. So in this particular case, this is our trafficker here, Pac-Man, and he had that on his wall. LOL, today I told my girlfriend to be a stripper. He also had friends with a record company. So his account linked to this Facebook account for the record. I have air quotes going on with that, record company. And there he had posted, "What do you think?" It included a song called Pac-Man Pippin. That ended up being linked to a SoundCloud account where the actual song that he had written and performed called Pac-Man Pippin was embedded there. And we went ahead and downloaded that for our amusement and potentially to use at trial for demonstrative purposes because the lyrics of the song actually mirrored what the accusations against him were. So the scope, when you're looking at this from the backpage.com, you're going to be able to identify other victims. They're going to link one particular ad to other ads. Now, Backpage, like I said, they're fairly law enforcement friendly. So if you subpoena them one ad, so you just you have the ad that your undercover officer used when he made the phone call. That ad's going to have both a post ID and a phone number. So you can subpoena both the post ID and any related ads or the phone number and any related ads. And you could potentially get thousands and thousands of pages of responses from Backpage because Backpage is going to internally link for you all the ads that use the same phone numbers, that use the same email addresses, that use the same payment method. So just issuing that subpoena to Backpage is going to give you a lot of information by the sheer volume of ads that they give back to you. So again, that's something that Backpage will do by themselves is give you all the links to all the other ads. Within the ads themselves, not only does Backpage give you the ad as your undercover officer would have seen it, but it also will include any photographs that were once associated with the ad had been since deleted. So not only can the user delete photos, sort of updating their ads for their customers, but Backpage will also monitor the ads and delete particular ads that they find are offensive, too graphic, and things like that. But they'll keep them on that administrative information that they give to you pursuant to a subpoena. It also will show you, because they're all going to be linked over the course of time, you will see that the ads will be posted in different locations. You'll have different IP addresses, and you'll also have this payment information that will go into a little bit more. So that's just a sense of just that one subpoena, how much information you're going to get. So here's an example, and it's not as clear because we had to blurry these images, but essentially we had one known victim, and this is a partial piece of her ad, and she identified herself by a false name and a phone number. However, when we got the results back from Backpage, one of the deleted images was of a white woman that was clearly not the same woman pictured in the ad itself. That's when an investigator is alerted, hey, this isn't just one girl that's being trafficked here, but there are potentially other victims because at some point they were both included on this same ad. And here you can see above the photograph, it says deleted by BP22. That means Backpage internally deleted that photograph for whatever reason, probably because it was a little too sexually explicit for their liking. But this is one of the ways, by looking at the deleted images, that you can find other victims. And I will just note here that because these pictures, a lot of the pictures are deleted because they are so sexually explicit, that's the number one reason, you will also find when you're dealing with cases of juveniles that are being trafficked, you could potentially find sexual child pornographic photographs in this section. And that's just something else to keep in mind, as always, for another co-occurring crime if you can connect that to the possession of the trafficker. This is just an example of all the different Backpage ads that were connected to the same user, but you can see sort of going from Ohio to Maryland to the Florida Keys to Miami. This particular trafficker worked his girls in a circuit in sort of in the eastern part of the United States. And so this is something that for trial is, very demonstrative. And even if you could plot this out on a map and show the actual circuit that's continually being used by this trafficker, that can be really significant testimony. So now we'll talk about the Backpage.com information that they give us regarding payment. They recently, and this is several months ago, but there was a recent change where you have to separately subpoena the payment information. And usually it's just a quick follow-up email sometimes. And it comes in an Excel spreadsheet. And this is, if you can see it, a little bit how it looks. The date and then some sort of gibberish and then more gibberish. But the far right is the credit card number that was used. And most likely those are going to be connected to a prepaid card. So how do you take that information and make it something that's useful for your investigation? Well, this is one of, I think there's several ones, but this is one of the websites that we use, which is the VIN database. And again, this is a really simple website to use. I think you get a couple of searches for free, and then they ask you to become a member of the site. But you can, again, just enter in the credit card number, and it will tell you who it belongs to. Not just if it's a Visa or a MasterCard, but who the bank is, who the person you can subpoena is. So even when it comes to prepaid credit cards that you don't have, you just have this information, you can tell, and it'll come and spit out what this was a net spend one, or One Vanilla, or Green Dot, or American Express. All of these prepaid cards which traffickers are using because, of course, they don't believe that they leave a trail behind, but those digital breadcrumbs exist. Once you get that information from the website, you can subpoena the actual card, whether it be Net Spend or One Vanilla. You send them a subpoena with that credit card information. Usually they like you to give a time frame as well, and they will give you a lot of information regarding that card with a pure subpoena. So again, here's the website itself, binlookup.net. And with that subpoena, they'll give you if the card was registered. Now, of course, many times the card is not registered at all, but many times they are, because they're to register and reuse the prepaid cards, there are certain benefits. So some traffickers do actually register them so that they can reload them and things like that. So you'll have any name or email address that's associated with the card. And even if you don't have that, what you will always have is the point of purchase and all the transactions that are associated with the card. So the point of purchase can be helpful. If it's in quick turnaround, you could even, it'll tell you it's the CVS on this corner. You could even subpoena surveillance video to see who bought that at that date and time, because it'll give you that specific of information. But what's probably more practically helpful is the transactions and the history of transactions that are used. Okay, so with the transactions, you're usually going to have, you'll see the payments to Backpage. wonderful. And then you'll also see any other charges that are made, usually hotels, rental cars, that type of thing. So at trial, how do you introduce this? These can be introduced with the use of business record certificates. I know Backpage.com and most other companies like this are more than happy to fill out a business record in hopes that you don't call live custodians of records. However, I would suggest that you do explore calling the custodian of records, because these records aren't going to be self-explanatory, and you may end up having to sort of testify yourself or having your lead detective explain these records. It's good courtroom drama to have the custodian of records from Backpage actually come and testify, and they're more than happy to do that, and tell the jury how this works, how people post things, how they can pay to have it at the top of the line, how they can have a premium account so that Backpage is continually posting them at the top of it. And then that sort of live testimony, the jurors really like it. It's interesting to them, and it makes the records come alive a little bit, especially if you're at a position where you're not going to have a victim. So I would encourage to have live testimony if at all possible. The ads themselves that are viewed by the detective can come in as photographs. So that is just asking your detective, during your investigation, did you utilize Backpage.com? Yes, I did. Okay, did you pull up a certain ad? Yes, I did. And then show them the ad and say, is this a fair and accurate depiction of the ad that you saw and that you responded to? And that should be admissible, although judges are not, they can get nervous over this sort of technology, so you may have to explain to them that it's no different than a photograph, and that any issues that they may have with sort of the chain of custody can be solved by explaining to the jury that it goes to the weight of the evidence and not to the admissibility. And then I encourage you to use demonstrative exhibits whenever possible to really bring this evidence alive. Like we were talking about the maps, timelines, that type of information. So trial without a victim. Now, just based on the Backpage ad alone and sort of what we talked about with the undercover officer coming to the hotel, having the words of solicitation and then the ad. If you can connect the trafficker, or in this case, let's say we can't prove the trafficking because we don't have a victim to testify to, the force, fraud, or the coercion, but we still have some sort of pimping or pandering statute, then we can go forward on that. As long as we can connect the trafficker to the girl from that room, we should be able to go forward on the pimping and pandering statute. Case law, and feel free to message us if you need any specific case law that shows this, but the case law does say that if you can connect the pimp to the placement of those ads, that the nature of those ads, the sexually explicit photographs, the language in those ads, that alone does show knowledge and intent, and you can impute that into the pimp, the trafficker. So that is a really great case law to make that connection. Additionally, the words of solicitation, and therefore the corpus, are not subject to hearsay or the confrontation clause. So courts have said that those words of solicitation are like a verbal contract, and they're admissible as non-hearsay, or an exception to hearsay, depending on your state. And also, they've been found not to be testimonial, so they do not violate the confrontation clause. Therefore, your detective should be able to testify to that interaction and that the prostitution existed, and then all you really are having to do is prove that the offender is connected. So moving on to the prepaid debit cards, and we talked a lot about this already, so here's a couple of the examples. The green dot, the one that's vanilla. So with the subpoena, you receive all that information. You also receive sort of reload information and transactional history that we'll see. Here's where you want to be thinking, putting on your creative charging cap, and be thinking about your money laundering statutes and your racketeering statute, because these prepaid debit cards are used basically to hide or convert cash and to facilitate the criminal activity of the operation. with all of the transitional history that you get, each and every transaction is another lead for where you can look. So you're going to have your online ads, your hotels, your plane tickets, your bus tickets, your rental cars, all these means of transportation. Once you see the charge, then you subpoena the airline, the bus ticket, the hotel for further information. Additionally, you're just going to see sort of food, clothing, condoms, other evidence that that we're really talking about the sex industry and the prostitution, and that can at least give us to that level. Here's a fun one. So this is an example of transactional history that you're likely to receive. Sort of date and time, some internal codes, the amount, and what it's paid for. And this is very typical. You're going to have back page, and then intermittently you're going to have some other things. In this case, it's 2 rentals for a scooter on South Beach. And so with subpoenaing the scooter company, we got the rental agreement, and this particular scooter company actually takes photographs of the renter with the scooter and keeps that with the rental agreement so that they can prove the identity of the person that rented it, which made it really convenient here that we have the same person that's renting the scooter. There's his photograph. There's all this personal information. And when it comes to who was placing those ads, we have very strong circumstantial evidence that it's the same person. Here's an example of the transactional history, and this is very typical. You're just your back page consistently, one after another. And in this case, we're also having these account transfers between 2 individuals. And that can come into play when you're talking about trying to build a RICO or trying to establish the different participants in the operation. So here's some more, and I think we've sort of redacted this to a point where it doesn't make a lot of sense. But in this particular case, what we're trying to show you is that these are constantly people transferring money to and from each other. So whether it be the trafficker to the bottom, the trafficker to his parents, the trafficker to an under pimp, something like that, that can really go to help establish a conspiracy, a RICO, a money laundering type organization. So again, once we're at trial, these will come in as business records, but always consider bringing in a custodian of records to testify live what everything means, and also to sort of emphasize the fact that this is otherwise very anonymous type of way to use money and to pay for things. So your big problem that you're going to hear from defense attorneys is, who is actually using the card. And this is like every other thing. We're looking at circumstantial evidence. So go back to your transactional history and see if you can tie the trafficker to another transaction, whether it be the hotel, the trafficker puts the hotel in his name, the rental car, or in that other case, the rental scooter. And you also want to link your records with the testimony. You really need to make sure you go through with your lead detective all of this digital evidence and lay it out and make sure that there's that the detective is going to be able to testify to the investigative flow and what he came across. So yes, I saw this card. Then I got the subpoena. Then I got this other subpoena. You can't just put in all these records and then try to get the jury to sort of figure it out. And then again, just the demonstrative exhibits, and you can imagine with how creative you could get there to really sort of show what's going on to your jury. So the last piece that we're going to talk about is the forensic examinations of the cell phones, and this in itself could be its own webinar. Cell phones, laptop computers, digital tablets, more and more. So we're really going to touch on just a couple of things in your forensic examinations of the cell phone. This is both for the victim's phone and the defendant's phone if you have search warrants and proper consent. First off, you want to make sure the evidence is preserved. Investigators that are, more and more, every investigator is going to be pretty aware that you need to take the battery out, you need to put it in airplane mode, you need to get it in a Faraday bag, whatever it be, you need to make sure you're preserving this digital evidence. You're going to need a warrant or consent. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with the latest Supreme Court case on that, but if you need any technical assistance, please let us know. And then here's just a tip for the investigators. When they're talking to victims, witnesses, the trafficker himself, ask for the passwords. That's going to really make this a lot easier on your examiner and potentially be, a yes or no whether you're even going to get into these phones more and more. So ask for the password. Speak to the examiner beforehand. Let them know what kind of investigation is, what you're looking for. If you can narrow the scope of the examination at all, your examiner is going to love you for that if they're not going on a mass fishing expedition. In these cases, it's hard to do that, unlike a child pornography case where you can tell your examiner, oh, just get me the child porn. Here we really do need sort of the full context of these phones and computers. But where you can narrow, do go ahead and narrow. And then one of the pieces that is becoming more and more prevalent that you should be aware of and that your examiner, you should ask your examiner to do is the manual examination of the phone. When we're talking about third-party applications, we're talking about Who's App, Facebook, just a pure forensic download of that phone is not going to get the information that's included in those third-party applications. But a warrant should allow you to go through there and manually examine those third-party applications, and your examiner can photograph himself or herself going through those. So here's all the different things you can get. And this isn't an exhaustive list, and I'm sure you're familiar with all of this, but we're going to go through a couple of them specifically. So here are the contact lists. And I'm sure if anyone's gone through a phone of an offender, you're going to realize that these are not first and last names that are typically being used. But the fake names are also very instructive. So here we have some phone numbers that are under ignore. If this is the phone of a trafficker or victim, these may be former Johns that were abusive or didn't come through or they had problems with. Obviously, they have in here some phone numbers related to who they believe were police officers. Possible in-house. This is somebody that maybe they were recruiting. These are Johns that actually came, and it says where and when and how much. So this can be really great information here in calls. A realtor, possibly somebody that knows where they were living, if they had a home base and were working at a motel. And then Eric Hartz, this is a drug dealer that was supplying all the girls with their drugs. So we're talking about potential co-conspirator. And then, of course, just the fact that the trafficker is using the name Daddy A+, that's great circumstantial evidence of what's going on. So your call log, obviously this isn't going to give you any content of what is said, but the frequency of the calls, the patterns of the calls may be able to pinpoint if there's a pattern that the girl needs to check in with the trafficker when the John comes, and then after he leaves, you may be able to corroborate a victim's testimony about particular rules of checking in and checking out. So there's something there to be said. Text messages. Here's the bread and butter of why we're trying to get into these phones. And I'm sure most of you have, are somewhat familiar with these. But I have some examples here. And, of course, this is Daddy A+ again. And we have communication between the John and the victim in this case. And that establishes just the basic that prostitution is going on. So that helps us just that baseline. But also you have, this is the trafficker himself is advertising his girl via the text messages. And you also have, here we have some more that is going to show you sort of the nature of the relationship. How much did you make? Where are you? And I think, here we have, damn, I thought you were a ride or die. You roll over quick. So reading through these voluminous text messages, you really get a sense of the nature of the relationship. You'll see the affection and then, the demeaning comments and things like that. And if you have a victim that can testify as to that, it's going to be really powerful evidence. I just included this on the left because it shows you what it looks like when you have a manual examination. This is actually the examiner's thumb or finger that's scrolling through these text messages because they weren't otherwise able to download them. And again, more here on the right-hand side, that has some of the content that is going to be powerful. This is MMS. MMS is multimedia. I don't know what the S is actually, but it's basically text messaging that includes some sort of media, so videos, pictures, music, things like that. And how it comes up in a report is there's going to be a hyperlink here that's to two pictures. So what this is here is this is a trafficker that basically sent this photograph to all of his contacts saying, hey, I think it just says $80 right here, just the price tag for her, and then that's his signature. And then again, that signature is going to be his initials, which will help you out. But he basically just sends this picture and says $80, and he's sending it to, you know, White Boy and Big Key and Bondman and, you know, Gunman and Dread. So this is, and if you can present this to a jury where you're actually using the hyperlinked report and you're pressing on that hyperlink and that photo is coming up, that's a wonderful thing to do for jury appeal. Also, in this case, the same photograph was the photograph that was used in the back page ad. So this trafficker was not only posting her online through the back page online escorts, but then this was sort of like a secondary means of getting business, which was just sending out that picture to his contact list. And then we have just the photographs and the videos that you're going to see in the phone. Always be mindful. You're going to find some potentially child pornographic pictures in there when you're dealing with juvenile victims. But here's another example of some photographs that can help you sort of beyond your first glance. Here is both the trafficker and the victim with the same car. So that puts them together, even though these came from two different phones. But in this particular one, and it depends on your make and model of your phone and the examination, but this actually had a direct link to the Google map showing where this picture was taken. So if that picture is, if that map takes you to an apartment, a strip club, a motel, that's going to be something else you can follow up on and be really great evidence. Also in the phone, what you'll see saved a lot are these sort of icons that they use in the online advertisements, the disclaimers. And if the trafficker has this in his phone, you can make the argument that he was clearly the one posting the ads because he has that disclaimer right in his phone to do that. Just other things of value really quickly. You'll see that email accounts will be linked. Right here, you'll see two email accounts that are associated with this particular phone, both referring to Casanova. I think we mentioned him before. But what this was really great for is that we had Subpoena back page with this first email address, not knowing about the second email address. Once we saw the second email address, we were able to Subpoena back page again, and they had not linked them internally because he was using different phone numbers and different IP addresses and different payment, but we were able to find another set of back page ads that, of course, led to further and further investigation. You also have calendars, task lists. The calendars and the task lists are really helpful to when you need to put that phone in somebody's hands. They may have birthdays, it may have mom, and you know it's the trafficker's mom and not the victim's mom, and then you can put the ownership of the phone to the trafficker. Just browser history, you'll see, obviously, going on to backpage.com, you'll also see them booking flights and hotels, the Wi-Fi and location data. And this is another example of how that may show up, and that's a third-party application down here that may need to be manually searched. So at trial, the big piece is you're going to have to establish ownership and use. So where was the phone found? But most likely it's going to come down to the content of the phone, that you're going to have to be able to show that who was the user of this phone. And oftentimes the phones will be shared. So if you don't have a cooperating victim, you really need to go through each piece of that phone to make the correct argument that this is, in at least part of it, was the trafficker's phone. And he knew and and placed these ads or made these reservations or took these photographs. And so every piece of that phone is going to give you more evidence of who was the user of the phone. So I encourage you to use your pretrial motions to encourage victim privacy. Also, redact this information. Just because the victim is a victim of a crime doesn't mean her entire cell phone needs to be searched by the defense attorney as well. So use your motions for protective orders, provide redactions, ask the court to view things in camera if there's any problem there, and ultimately you'll rely on the probative v. prejudicial argument. If there's a picture of the victim smoking pot, you really need to be aware of that. You may not think it's such a big deal, but you're going to gain a lot of victim trust if you're really looking out for them in that matter. And then the forensic examiner. This is something you'll have to think about. Sometimes you do want to make sure that they are qualified as an expert. In the more detailed examinations, that becomes more important. However, some of these phones, simple downloads, are literally, done with 2 pushes of the button, and some patrol guy did it because they have this equipment that, Cellbrite gave them. And in that case, you don't want to make him an expert and subject to looking like a fool when he can or she can't answer all those super technical questions. In that case, it's been very successful to just kind of dumb it down and make it seem this isn't rocket science. This is pushing a couple buttons. And if you kind of compare it to downloading contacts at your AT&T store when you were, switching phones, the jury can really understand that the basic examination does not include a lot of expertise, and there's really not like an avenue for tampering for any of those things. So going forward, prosecutors, law enforcement, everybody needs to make sure they're keeping to date, not with just technology itself, but also with trends, how victims are using social media, online platforms, their smartphones. Like I mentioned before, every time a victim comes in and you talk about how they communicate with their friends, they're using WhatsApp or Kik, and I'm probably already behind the times with what type of trends they're using. So you need to keep up to date, and your advocates and your victims themselves can really help you with that. And make sure your examiner and your investigators and everyone on the team is doing their best to keep up to date. Corroborate every possible detail you can, where it may not be key to was this girl trafficked or not. When a victim testifies and you can corroborate every other little piece of their story, whether it be where it happened, what hotel they were at, what rental car they used. If you're able to corroborate that, then the rest of her testimony is more credible as well, and your case is more provable. So to continue to educate each other, learn, and also be prepared to educate your judge and your jury about digital evidence. As I mentioned, judges are shy about this. They are oftentimes not very comfortable making evidentiary determinations based on digital evidence. So you need to be prepared to make the correct arguments, make analogies that they can understand, whether it be to a photograph or to an old-fashioned data book or anything like that. Be prepared for that. And then in closing, I just say make sure you're following these digital breadcrumbs and making sure that the traffickers are being held accountable, not just for their trafficking, but all the other concurrent crimes that you'll find evidence of once you do follow those digital breadcrumbs. So that is the end of the presentation. We have a few minutes if anyone has any questions. You can private chat Charlie.
Thank you so much, Jane, and I want to thank everyone else in attendance for your participation and your dedication today to increasing victim safety and offender accountability in your communities and across the country. And as Jane mentioned, we do have a few more moments, so we'll stay on the webinar as well as on the line for any questions you have, any comments, if there's any follow-up you're interested in getting more information about, please don't hesitate to reach out. When you do exit Ilink, So we encourage you to visit our website, www.equitasresource.org, where you can register for future webinars and training events. You can review additional information about Equitas, and previous webinars that have been recorded are available as well. You will also be receiving a link to a SurveyMonkey evaluation for this webinar, along with a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and Jane's full biography. Please respond to the follow-up email if you're interested in information regarding continuing legal education credits. And also, please do remember that Equitas is a 24/7 technical assistance provider, and we're available to respond to questions, concerns, and training needs as they relate to the prosecution of violence against women. On behalf of Equitas, thank you all so much for participating in today's webinar, and as I said, we'll be on the line for a few more minutes for any follow-up questions.
Charlie?
Yes.
I wasn't sure if I was still on.
You are. You can go ahead and answer the question.
Okay, there's a question about the entrapment disclaimer. I'm assuming you mean that little disclaimer that's placed on the ads, on the backpage ads. I have never seen a successful defense of entrapment based on that ad. Additionally, it doesn't really come up in this context because it would only be for the victim that was potentially being prosecuted for prostitution. So hopefully if you are prosecuting the trafficker, you are not also prosecuting the victim, or we don't really use the term prostitute, but just so that you have clarity of what I'm talking about. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Jane. Thank you again all so much for your participation. And if you have any continuing questions, please don't hesitate to reach out via email or phone. Have a great evening.